Hi BookTube, it's Amy. I'm here with a Friday Reads. Last night I read just over half of a biography of late 19th century, early 20th century author Frederick Philip Grove. Now, I read one of Grove's novels several years ago called The Fruits of the Earth. I don't recall whether I liked it all that much. I don't even remember what it was about. But a couple months ago, I had been in one of the bookstores here in Ottawa, the Book Bazaar, and I came across this, and I was looking for some more interesting 20th century memoir and autobiography. It was shortly after I had read Memoirs from Beyond the Grave by Chateaubriand. And I had also recently read Memoirs of Montparnasse by another Canadian author. And so I saw this and I thought, that is right up my alley. I would love to know more about the life of Frederick Philip Grove. And I brought it home and I sat it on my shelf, and last night I finally picked it up and I was immersed for about 3 or 4 straight hours, solid hours of reading. And it's hard to say. I would have to do further research about his life to figure out how much of this is truly fact and how much of it is embellished. But whether it's embellished or not, it is a fascinating story. So he was born in Sweden near the end of the 19th century to parents of mixed heritage. He had English background, but he was born in Sweden on what we would call today a grand aristocratic estate. A grand estate. His father was in farming, but it was the sort of farming where he himself did not do the physical farming himself. He had a whole household of people, of servants. There was a village that was literally on his land and owned by all the land in the village was owned by this estate. And so he grew up in a very privileged way, but it was not a happy household. His father was a good 20 years older than his mother, I believe. And his mother had previously had, I think it was 5 daughters. So he had 5 older sisters. And Grove was sort of born late, at the point when his youngest sister was like 13 or 14 when he was born. And so he didn't really grow up with his sisters. The sisters had all gone on with their lives and married by the time he started to come of age. But it was not a happy marriage. And so he ended up traveling frequently with his mother all over Europe and outside of Europe too. And so, before he reaches the age of 16, he's already lived and studied in many cities in Europe, many different countries. He's managed to speak not only Swedish, but also English. He's picked up French. He's picked up some Spanish, a little bit of Italian, I think. And he lived in Russia for a time, but not long enough to pick up the language. And he develops a taste for the classics. His mother has a career in business in mind for him because she's realized that his father has sort of run through 2 fortunes at this point and is probably going to die and leave everyone penniless. And she is currently running through her own fortune. And so she has decided that her son must have a career in business. But his head is in the clouds and he wants to attend university and study the classics and learn Greek and Latin. And he starts a course of self-study. And, after they've formally broken with his father, after his mother has formally left, not a divorce, but they have left and have been living apart for some time, he gets the opportunity to actually study Latin and Greek, ends up having a questionable affair with the wife of one of his teachers. I wonder how much of this is embellished because it's kind of a horrible thing, something that really makes you, judge the married woman who decided that she was going to engage in an affair and essentially prey on a 16, 17-year-old boy. But I also judge him pretty hard because according to his version of events, Their affair, the sexual part of their affair, began on his 17th birthday, and it ended when she announced her pregnancy. It was pretty clear that it couldn't be her husband because she said she hadn't been sleeping with her husband, and it was understood that her husband was unable to have natural children. And so that, of course, leads to the divorce, but off Grove goes, on with his life, without really much of a thought for this woman he's leaving behind with a child. And it's definitely a privileged notion of looking at the world, this idea that what she does and what happens to this child is none of his concern. He doesn't even mention it. He doesn't even say, like, my son. He just says, she was with child, it was a boy. There's no, like, accountability or ownership on his part. I mean, this married woman is pretty much preying on him to begin with, because, I mean, even at this time, he was a minor and she shouldn't have been sleeping with a 17-year-old. But it's just this odd situation where, the morals and the ethics of today sort of collide with this older notion. And I think it's partly the way he tells the story too. It was his sexual awakening, so to speak, and he's just willing to move on with his life as this event. And he sees it in some way as him becoming a man. He tells the story not to indicate that he has a child out there somewhere, or might have a child out there somewhere, or to talk about his first great love. Rather, it's, this is the moment that I went from child to man. And he later brings it up again when he's spending some time in Paris with a group of writers and artistic-minded young men. And he comes to the conclusion that many of them are gay, they're homosexual. But he sort of refers to this event in the past. And, the time he was writing, I sort of get why he would come to this with this perspective. But he says, sleeping with this married woman, that saved me from potentially being a homosexual. And I was sort of like, okay, then that's an odd perspective. But at the time when he was writing, let me just check when this was published. When it was published in 1946, you can see why that would sort of be a socially acceptable notion at the time. But it does cause me to wonder about his sexuality. If he felt he had the need to point out that the only reason he didn't engage in homosexual relationships was because he had slept with a woman at the age of 17. But that aside, so he's extremely wealthy. It's a very privileged upbringing. He has a yacht that he gets, sailed from place to place so he can enjoy it. He rides horses. He basically gets to travel all over the world. His uncle comes through town. I think it's his uncle or his great uncle, and says, I'm taking a trip to Siberia. Would you like to come with me? And he's supposed to be on his way to Paris to go to university because his father has set everything up for him now, with the idea that he'll go into law. But he decides to just skip Paris for a year and goes off to Russia and travels through Siberia with his uncle, which gives him a taste for the landscape. And then disaster strikes, and this is how he comes to be a Canadian writer. But his father, who's in his 70s by this point, suggests that he should do a tour of America. He just refers to it as America, but he's talking about both the United States and Canada. And we're in the 1890s by this point. His father suggests that he should do a tour of America before returning for his final year of university to then, study for the law and enter a career. And so off he goes to America. Things have gotten pretty bad by this point because his father has essentially sold his yacht to pay for the fare. Takes off his trunks, takes off with his trunks of clothes, first class on a ship, travels to the United States and Canada as a gentleman. But there is a certain point when he has almost run through his funds, finds himself in Toronto, sends a cable across the ocean to his father asking for more money, and instead he gets a response from a friend of the family who says, "I'm sorry to inform you, your father has died. I would advise you not to claim your inheritance, to deny your inheritance, because the estate is in so much debt that you will too be weighed down with this debt." And so he finds himself in this place where his mother has previously died. His father is now dead. He's not in contact with any of his sisters, and he is essentially stranded in Toronto. And so he begins working as a waiter and then eventually gets into farm labor, where he works as, a day laborer, as a teamster because he's good with horses, and adopts the life of a hobo. But not your typical hobo, because he manages to save up most of his funds. He has $200 in a bank in Winnipeg, Manitoba as his emergency fund. He manages to earn a couple $100 every year, enough to stock up for the winter, to find a place to live, either doing some light labor or not working at all and just living frugally, where he's writing, and he's trying to write these novels because it's always been his desire to be an author. But in the midst of all this, he's also managing to save up enough money that he takes a trip off to Europe every couple of years. And this goes on for the span of 20 years until he realizes that this just isn't working. He's around the age of 40. His body isn't what it used to be. He can't sleep out in the cold, the damp. And he realizes that this is taking a toll on his body. One bad season, and he has to dig into his emergency funds. And he's realizing that this just can't go on. And so I'm at the point in the book here where I think he is about to choose a new path for life. But at a certain point, he had sort of fallen in love with the Canadian landscape. He talks about feeling at home in the landscape of Siberia, of Russia, and then coming to Canada and feeling something very similar and feeling just very attracted to this landscape. And so at the age of, 21, in his early 20s, he's like hitching trains across the country out into the prairies, traveling on foot, spending time on the farms of northern Canada. And he would spend his winters in Canada. He would go south when the farming season came, and then he would come back north to Manitoba area to spend his winters. And he talks about another book in here. I think the title was Discovering America, which was the first novel that he tried to write. I'm not sure when it was published, but apparently he wrote and rewrote the draft several times, sent it to many publishers, was not picked up right away. But he says that he tells the story of the first part of his life, specifically that life as a farmhand and a teamster, in more detail in that book. But he says that he sort of compressed it and turned what was essentially his way of life for 20 years. So, a quarter to a third of his life, he compressed that into 1 year before he picked up that writing career. And so, of course, I have ordered myself a copy of that book, and I'm hoping it will arrive in the next few days. I already got a ship notification for it, and it is coming from a bookseller here in Canada, so it should arrive fairly quickly. Several years ago, when I first heard of Frederick Philip Grove, it was relatively easy to come across a few of his books. Settlers of the Marsh, Fruits of the Earth were two titles that were widely available. I think it was sometime in the early 2000s, New Canadian Library had republished a couple of his works. No longer available, can't find them on Amazon. I do see a copy on a books that I could purchase, but it's a little bit on the pricier side for a paperback. I think I would end up spending upwards of $30 just to get that. I think I might better find his books if I go in person to the physical used bookstores in the city of Ottawa and I look for the older versions of the New Canadian Library. So these colorful pocket paperbacks that were published in the 60s and the 70s by New Canadian Library of all of these quote Canadian classics, right when this idea of Canadian literature as something distinct was taking off. And I think I should be able to find those because I've seen them before. Surely they've still got to be kicking around out there. And I'm sure that if I go back to Book Bazaar or to Black Squirrel, I will likely be able to find some of Grove's works for a couple dollars each. But that is sort of my new adventure here. And I've got some sticky notes in here, some tabs. He's certainly coming from a different perspective, so there are some things that cause me to pause and think. Some of the comments that he makes about women, about his place in the world, he's definitely coming from a very privileged perspective. But all the same, it is fun and interesting to read about someone who loves literature, loves knowledge, and loves pursuing it. He talks about traveling with another hobo, another man who's working as a day laborer on farms. And both of them are highly educated to the point where they begin as a joke to have a conversation in French about French literature in the middle of a field, creating a sense of distrust between them and the other laborers. And so he talks about how it was almost a disadvantage to have this education, doing the kind of labor he was trying to do, and he had to hide his intense intelligence when he was trying to get a job, because it would sort of put people off. And I do wonder why he didn't try to take up teaching or try to take up a career of some sort, or try to find a job in Toronto and maybe finish a degree there. But he didn't, and he spent 20 years as a laborer, and I'll see what happens next. But this is interesting here. On page 86, he talks about beginning to pick up Greek. He says, I began to pick up a little Greek by myself. Having mastered the alphabet, I began to read, intoxicating myself with the sound of the language. In this, my mother gave me neither help nor encouragement. Even my tutor could not assist. I came to suspect that my mother had picked him for the sake of that disability. But here and there, now in Italy, now in France, and above all in Germany, I ran across a teacher who, thinking me a queer sort of child, mischievous though I was, took me humorously at first and indulgently, but who, as time went by, became interested and finally helped me. I was not yet 15 when I began to decipher and to memorize passages in Homer and Euripides. I seemed to have no organ for Sophocles. In Sappho, and he lists a number of poets here, all of them poets. I used cribs, a dictionary, and grammar, but I took no interest in the acquisition of the language as such, and used it only as a gateway to the literature. And further on here, page 91, he says, I must say a word about my reading here. From the time when I had mastered the mechanics of the art, I had been an omnivorous reader, and she had taken me in hand herself and directed my selection of books. He's talking about his mother here. By the time I was 14, I had not inconsiderable library of my own, and it consisted very largely of complete sets. On every birthday, I received, as a matter of course, at least one such set. The list was led by Scott, and Scott was followed by Byron. Then came Shakespeare, the latter, strange to say, at first in the German translation by Schlegel and Tieck, perhaps because we happened to be in Munich. But before the year was out, I had got an English Shakespeare as well, Schiller, Goethe, Manzoni, Leopoldi, Baudelaire, Flaubert, Dickens, Thackeray, Tennyson, Browning, Eliot, Macaulay, Carlyle followed. And with my pocket money, I acquired classical authors in both Latin and Greek. I could not really read the latter so far, but guided my reading of critical utterances. I picked out certain passages, especially in Homer, concentrated on them, and memorized them so thoroughly that to this day I can rattle them off by heart. Add to that, as I grew up, such diverse fare as Montaigne, Pascal, Keats, Shelley, Wordsworth, Holderlin, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, Verga, Cervantes, Lope de Vega, Calderon, Lesage, Corneille, Racine, Molière, and countless others of lighter weight. Stevenson, for instance, whose Kidnapped came out about that time, Mark Twain, Jules Verne, and you have a small idea of the extent of my reading. By acquiring standard histories of literature, a department of learning in which Germany excelled, I managed somehow even to organize my knowledge to a certain extent. I am today often amazed to find how much of my present reading is merely rereading of what I read at that time. And so this is definitely a biography for people who love literature, love to read about other people loving literature and discovering great books of reading. But he does get a little bit melodramatic about the idea of Canada here. He was publishing at a time when people were still very much concerned with the idea of, what does it mean to be Canadian? What does it mean for a work of literature to be Canadian? And so he is in some way engaging in the project of nation building here. And there's a quote here on page 150 where he says, like Siberia, Canada needed to be fought for by the soul, but very few Canadians know it. They think of it as a Europe enlarged, which is an interesting perspective because there was a time when people would think of Canada, as very European. Certainly not at this time. Definitely wasn't when he wrote this, because a lot of people who are trying to shape early Canadian literature completely ignored what even then was the very multicultural nature of Canadian society. And they completely ignored the First Nation and Indigenous cultures that had, been in North America and had created their own literatures long before these Europeans showed up and decided to make a project of it. But he goes on to talk about his life, about his youth, and what comes to head here is this distinction between, I wrote it on a sticky note here, life viewed as an adventure or life viewed as discipline. And he says, whereas his father viewed life as discipline, he certainly fell into this almost trap of viewing life as an adventure and not being disciplined. And he talks about how he was so caught up in wanting to see things and experience things and have fun and read literature and explore literature that he forgot to focus enough on the practical side of things, which was how he ended up, he says, without much of a career. But I would also like to mention here the prologue. The prologue caught me from the start. And I think I might read the prologue here, maybe in its entirety, because it's just that good. But it's just the idea of you go from this prologue where he's literally talking about being in middle of nowhere, cold Ontario, and then brings us into the first chapter of the book where he talks about this wealthy upbringing in Sweden. So the prologue to In Search of Myself. It was a dismal November day with a raw wind blowing from the northwest and cold iron-gray clouds flying low. One of those Ontario days which on the lake shores or in a country of rock and swamp seemed to bring visions of an ageless time after the emergence of the earth from chaos, or a foreboding of the end of a world about to die from entropy. It was into such a country of rock and swamp a few miles north of Lake Erie that my business took me that day. I was driving my old and battered car, and having come a not inconsiderable distance, I felt chilled and cheerless. At last I entered upon a straight rutted marl road which led for miles over a clay-colored dam thrown through a morass dotted here and there with the dead stumps of huge trees of a departed generation. Swamp oak, white ash, and pine now blackened by carbonization. At last there appeared on the far side of the marsh to my right, in the very border seam of higher wooded ground, a farm with house, barn, and other buildings, which at this distance seemed to be sketchily washed into their background of leafless bush, for they were unpainted and in a state of not merely incipient decay, resembling so many other in that Ontario, which had once been made prosperous by its timber. It was from this place that I was to fetch a girl for the Sisyphus tasks of a household drudge. And this prologue is apparently reprinted from the University of Toronto Quarterly in October of 1940. And he says, the closer I came, the worse the road grew, for it became more deeply rutted, and the ruts and their supporting sides were so wet, so almost greasy, that every now and then the rear wheels of my car skidded sideways, with a sickening effect at the pit of my stomach. the more deeply I penetrated into the district which a few days ago had been visited by a cloudburst, the slower did my progress become, till I could proceed only with extreme caution. I was wondering what I should do if I found it impossible to reach my destination. The dam had become narrow, and there was no longer even the ghost of a possibility of turning. Well, I said to myself, I suppose I must get through, and turn in the yard of the homestead. When I was within perhaps half a mile of the farm gate, I was crawling along at the rate of 2 or 3 miles an hour, in low gear, and then what I had dreaded happened. Across the dam, joining the swamp to swamp, extended a washout which put an imperative stop to my progress. I saw that I could never pull through that watery mud hole in which the bluish hardpan foundation of the landscape lay exposed, churned up by cows and horses that had dashed through in a panic, sinking in their hocks. As I sat there looking the situation over and canvassing with a shiver running down my spine, the 2 or 3 possibilities of action, a sudden vision of the evening before blotted out what lay in front of me. My profound feeling of misery no longer seemed to proceed from my momentary quandary, but from something I had lived through the previous night. In my own ramshackle house, which was yet capable of being warm and comfortable, I had had a caller from afar, and we sat up late into the night by lamplight, talking of books and of my early life in Europe, especially in Paris. The topic of my youth had been suggested by one of the books which had been discussed. My caller was the librarian of a great city, and for years he had dropped in on me once or twice a 12-month, bringing me some 6 or 10 volumes of the best that had come to hand within the time elapsed since his last visit, and taking away such as he had left behind on the last occasion. Among those he had brought this time was the biography of a Frenchman, still living, who in my early days had been one of my intimates. At the time, this young Frenchman and myself had been aflame with a great enthusiasm for life and art. For years we had been inseparable, so much so that old-fashioned and benevolent people, generals of the French army, aristocrats of the old school, venerable professors of the Sorbonne, had teasingly called us Castor and Pollux. In the dim light of my study, where the librarian and I had been sitting surrounded by the few books which I own, memories of my European youth had crowded back upon me, and I had risen to pace the floor of the room in a state of intense excitement. As they came back to me, I have told anecdotes of our Arden Association, and I had given expression of my unbounded youthful admiration for the young Frenchman, who, a year or 2 older than myself, had been one of the determining influences in overcoming my immaturities. Stranger than anything else, there had come back to me the memory of the attitude which this young Frenchman had observed towards myself, the attitude of a mentor coaching one of whom great things were expected, things greater than those within his own reach. Suddenly a silence had fallen between the librarian and myself, for with the effect of a sharp blow it had come to me that more than 4.5 decades separated me from those days, 4 decades in which that Frenchman and I had drifted apart to the point of complete alienation. Each had gone his own way, he in the crowded capitals of Europe, I on the lonely prairies of Western Canada. Like a flash of lightning, it had struck me that to earn the distinction of seeing his biography published within his lifetime, he must have achieved things which had focused on him the eyes of a world, a living world as full of fire and enthusiasm as any world that had ever been, whereas I, only slightly his junior, in spite of often titanic endeavors, had lived and worked in obscurity, giving expression at the best to a very few mirrorings of life in the raw, such as it had been my lot to witness. In that dead silence which my friend the librarian had had the charity to respect, I had turned dumbly back to my desk, and shaking with a new, still deeper excitement, I had let myself sink into the chair by the shaded reading lamp. With trembling fingers I had reached for the book and drawn it into the circle of light, opening it at the last pages, where I expected to find a bibliography. The bibliography was there, and it was put together with obvious care and completeness, filling 18 pages. Translations of the works of this Frenchman had appeared in no less than 16 countries, Turkey and Japan among them. If it is true, I said to myself, that all the stars are moved when a child drops a ball from its cradle, what effect had the life of this Frenchman had on the reeling universes of human thought and human sentiment? Whereas I... And another memory had arisen. On one of my 4 or 5 trips back to Europe, undertaken during the years when on this continent of America I had lived as a farmhand, I had on one single occasion once more met that young Frenchman, no longer quite so young by previous appointment. We had had dinner together in one of the great famous restaurants of Paris, and tragically we had found that we had nothing any longer to say to each other. However, here it was my present task to bring back with me that household drudge from the farm in the margin of the higher land to my right and ahead. Since I was mired on the road, what was I to do? And maybe I'll stop there, because he just begins with this explanation that the reason he is writing his biography, his memoir, his autobiography at all, is because he has come face to face with the realization that someone he knew in his youth became a far greater man than he feels that he is. And so he is reflecting on exactly how his life differed, what went on in his life that led him to the backwoods of Canada, whereas his friend who served as a mentor and who once felt that he would become perhaps greater than even he was, his friend went on to have this great writing career in Europe. And so that sort of sets the tone for the whole book. And I am 230 pages in and I'm excited to finish it. I might even try to finish it tonight. But now that I've spent 31 minutes talking about a single book, I'm going to pick up a couple of books that I may dig into this weekend. It's shaping up to be a rainy autumn weekend here. Good day for reading indoors. I think I'm going to dip into a collection of essays that arrived in the mail yesterday. This is titled A Happy Half-Century by Agnes Ruplier. It's somewhere along the lines of the sort of essay collections I've been reading by A. Edward Newton and James Milne. And so it'll be interesting to dig into something by a woman contemporary of theirs, published in 1908. I won't talk too much about it because I haven't started it yet. I did read the preface last night. I think I even posted a picture of this on my Instagram because I thought I was going to read it. And then I decided I was going to read in the bath. And I didn't want to take this in with me just because the paper is so spotless. And I thought, what if I splash a drop of water onto the pages? I would be somewhat disappointed. Whereas this one is more yellowed and more battered. And I thought, this is good tub reading. And so I started to read that instead. But I think I'm going to dig into that collection of essays. And I may also begin reading the one book on my shelf by A. Edward Newton that I haven't dug into yet. And this is A Magnificent Farce, one of his essay collections. And this one, just flipping to the publication date here, this is his collection from 1921. And we have chapters in here on what is the matter with the bookshop, on commencing author, luck, a slogan for booksellers, Walt Whitman, 20, just the letter 20 in quotes here, living 25 hours a day, a chapter on William Blake, and My Old Lady London. And so I'm thinking it's going to be another wonderful collection of characteristic essays on books and all things literary by Newton. So there's that. And that's what I'm up to. That's my reading in the past week and what's moving forward. I still have Pope's translation of Homer's Iliad on the go. And so I may pick that up again too. I'm still slowly working my way through the volume of The Tattler from 1709, 1710 that I've been working on. That is something I sort of sample before bed sometimes. And I do have Gaddis's novel, JR, over on my table that I haven't touched in 2 or 3 weeks here. But if I'm in the mood for fiction sometime soon, perhaps I'll pick that up as well. So that is how things stand on this Friday in September, the first Friday of autumn.